So what was very interesting is the insectageddon came about from a paper that came up from a literature review across studies, came up with a number that they said that 40% of insect species were threatened with extinction over the next few decades. And I think it was the number that were going to go extinct, and then the fact that it was going to happen over the next few decades. That sort of got researchers thinking, that's a little bit over the top.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we explore biodiversity conservation and the environment more broadly and interrogate conventional wisdom for the sake of a more robust case for conservation. I'm your host, Andre Mardo. Insects are among the most abundant organisms on Earth. About 350,000 beetle species alone have been described by science, and this is considered to be only a fraction of the total number. In a variety of ways, insects are a fundamental part of natural and human-adapted systems. While some cause disease or ruin crops, others play a key role in ecosystem service provision, for example by pollinating certain crops or as food for other beneficial animals and people. Overall, the loss of insect species is a major concern. Some of the more exuberant headlines broadcasting this message have gone so far as to declare an imminent insectageddon. However, although many insect species are declining or in danger of decline, there's reason to be wary of such excessive claims. Data need to be carefully considered, revealing the complex patterns of change. Unfortunately, the media in particular is often incentivized to focus on the more extreme findings and neglect the nuances. Jane Hill is president of the Royal Entomological Society and a professor at the University of York. She helps me to pick apart the insectageddon idea, including how valid it is and how it came about in the first place. I asked Jane to begin with a bit of a background on the world of insects, for example, their abundance and their distribution.
There are a number of insects that people absolutely love. And of course, there are also some insects that cause us a huge amount of harm. And I think that combination between those of them that cause harm by being vectors of disease, as well as the insects that we love to see around us that bring us joy and importance culturally and for pollination, means that we care a lot about insects. We care and notice when they decline because we lose those lovely things that we like seeing around us. And of course, if insects increase, particularly the ones that are pests of our crops or cause us harm by, being a vector of disease, then we really notice that as well. And I think that's part of the reason why people care about what's happening to insects. And, where I'm based at the University of York in the UK, my perspective is often quite a UK-based one. And actually, a lot of the information we have about insects does come from the UK. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. One is that even before Victorian times, so for hundreds of years, British people seem to just like recording things. They just like wandering around in nature and just noting them down. I don't think because they thought that those data would be used for anything. I think they just really enjoyed collecting. So our museums are full of pinned specimens because these Victorian collectors went out and collected things. And although I guess the ethics of doing that now would probably not be favoured, the information they collected has turned out to be invaluable. So the UK is a location where there are a lot of people interested in insects, but there aren't that many insects. And the recording, certainly some of the robust, really detailed recording goes back about 50 years or so. So that combination of things means that we have really good knowledge about how insect distributions and abundances have been changing over time. But what it doesn't tell us, of course, is what's happening globally and what's happening in parts of the world where insect diversity is orders of magnitude greater than that in the UK. Because, the UK is a cool, from the point of view of the climate, it's relatively cool compared with the tropics, for example, and insects are cold-blooded organisms. So everything that they do, whether it's flying or reproducing or eating food or developing, is dependent on the ambient temperature and conditions. And so we tend to be a fairly low diversity country, but nonetheless, you'll find that most of the information about changes in insects and insect trends does come from countries that have good recording, and there's not a huge number of those. The US and other countries in Europe as well, of course, but particularly the UK.
How much of a contribution has been made, looking back over the past couple of centuries, how much of a contribution has been made by explorers from the UK? Because when you started speaking, I immediately started thinking about those old lithographs and paintings and things of plants and animals. Did they not focus very much on insects, or were they also bringing back large numbers of insects, or was it simply just a small dent in the variety that was out there?
No, particularly butterflies were incredibly popular with collectors. And so if you think about those collectors that were collecting for commercial reasons, they knew that there would be people back in Europe who would want to purchase what they were collecting. So UK explorers like Alfred Russel Wallace, who was collecting in Southeast Asia, he would know which butterflies, amongst all the other things that he brought back as well, but he would bring back butterflies, because particularly the swallowtails, that are just such amazing things. But I say, because collecting was such a popular pastime in the UK, he knew that if he brought material back, there would be people to buy it, and also ending up in museum collections as well. So we have a research project at the moment here in York, where we're working with collaborators in the Natural History Museum to look at the swallowtails on Sulawesi, and actually other taxa within the butterflies as well. But the swallowtails are particularly well collected, and there are specimens in the museum that we can look at that go back more than 150 years. So they sort of open up a much longer term understanding of how insects have changed over time as a consequence of what's housed in all of those drawers in the museums.
Right. And so I guess it's a case of those taxa, the butterflies in particular, being kind of a proxy for the insect kingdom as a whole, if you're looking back a few hundred years.
Yeah, I mean, the birds obviously were also very popular to collect, and plants too, particularly when you're thinking about crop plants as well, and insects from a pest perspective as well. So obviously people are very interested in understanding what's causing harm to crops and understanding those, and actually trying to get the insects to be less, to forcing them to decline, if you like, whereas other insects we're wanting to increase in abundance. I think you can split entomologists into two groups: those people who want to conserve and raise the numbers, and those people who want to kill them off and decrease the numbers, both of them for valid reasons, of course, but it's quite an interesting split between whether you want to kill them or save them.
Right. And of course, you're talking about a different group of two different groups of insects there, as you mentioned earlier. But do you have an idea? And I know these are always tricky, especially with the smaller creatures, but do we have any idea of what the global number of species is at the moment, and whether that's, well, let me ask that for now. That's probably the most basic question.
So the basic question of how many insect species there are on Earth is a really interesting question, and the quick answer to it is we don't know. So when we're thinking about what is the global richness of species, most of those are based on estimates. And that's why if you Google how many species are there on Earth, or how many species of insects are there on Earth, you'll get a wide variety of numbers. And it's quite interesting to think about why we don't know. And I think some people would argue why don't we know? As society, we really should. Why are we going off to explore other planets and spend an enormous amount of time going to the moon or Mars or wherever, where we don't even understand our own planet well? And I completely understand that, because you would think that the very sensible question you asked, which is how many insect species are there on Earth, we sort of answer that by now. The first people who really started to think about this there was a really interesting paper back in the 80s where Terry Irwin, who was working in the tropics, used fogging technique on one species of tropical tree and fogged them and collected all the insects that fell off from this fogging process, and then used that to sort of extrapolate up. And he counted all the insects and worked out how many insect species were on that species of tree, and how many were specialized, who only fed on that particular species of tree, how many trees there are in the world, and so on. You can sort of multiply up. And he got to 30 million.
Wow.
And people thought that's an interesting number, but it seems very, very high. So it spurred a lot of really interesting further analyses into how many insects there might be, and the numbers sort of then started to come down. So the sorts of numbers that you will see now are an order of magnitude lower than that. So somewhere between 3 and 5 million is probably the number. But even then, you can see there's still a wide range of values across that. And a lot of that is because there are countries in the world that are very highly biodiverse, have a huge number of species, and it's a real challenge to collect them, to identify them, and to name them. And so by naming them, I mean give them the Latin name that every species that we have on Earth gets given a Latin name when it's been identified and named. And that's the process we go through when we identify insects. So there are insects that we know exist that haven't been named yet. And part of that is because there's just not enough taxonomists available to do that. So the taxonomists are the experts who put names on species, and there's a formal process to go through to get that species named and accepted into science. So there are some species waiting for that to happen. And of course, it's also a challenge to sample all of the insects, given the wide range of different groups. So that's one thing. Another challenge is the question, what is a species? That's also quite a complex question. And very often it's down to the taxonomists to decide how different are two individuals in order to make them a different species. There is the biological species concept, which is that two species are separated if they can't breed successfully with each other. But obviously, that's often not a very useful concept, because you often can't test whether or not a species can reproduce and produce fertile offspring. That's not possible with all of these millions of insects. And so taxonomists spend an inordinate amount of time looking at the genitalia of insects to try and work out whether they could potentially breed or not. And then that's a way of testing that. And then, of course, DNA will become very helpful. And I think over time, and possibly very quickly, actually, given the changes in DNA and the how cheap it's become, I suspect that DNA surveys of communities will start to very quickly generate information that we need, the sort of barcoding of life type approach. And although that sounds like a quick fix, you still need to decide how different genetically do individuals have to be in order to be different species. But I mean, we can set thresholds to that and just decide. And I think probably if we apply our effort and the finances to do that, I think the barcoding approach is going to be very successful.
Right. Actually, a few episodes ago, I had a really interesting chat with a guy named Frank Zakos, who's the head of the mammal collection at the Natural History Museum in Vienna. And it was all about this topic, different species concepts and the difficulties in actually calling something a species or not. But those are some interesting specifics that you mentioned there about insects. I want to just ask one. We haven't actually entered the main topic yet, but just one other question I wanted to just fit in there was something which I think maybe a lot of people might not realize is that there are virtually no insects in the sea, which is quite interesting, and they're kind of replaced by crustaceans. Is there a particular reason for that, or is it simply that they diverged at a certain point in history? Is that what it boils down to?
So, of course, they are all arthropods, so they are relatively closely related, if you like. So, if you go back through the evolutionary tree of life, you can see where they'll have split off. And that's quite an interesting observation, actually, that maybe certain groups of arthropods went off and colonized the sea, and whereas others colonized Earth and did on terrestrial locations and did very well there. So not, I mean, if you think about, so insects are part of the arthropod group, which are all invertebrates, and sometimes I guess those terms get used interchangeably, but actually they are quite different. So you've got your invertebrates without a backbone, and then you've got your arthropods, and then going down through that, you come into your insects, which are a different group, but still insects are about 40% of all species on Earth. So it's a hugely diverse and species-rich grouping.
And crustaceans are nowhere near as diverse as that, are they?
No, no. And it's interesting why certain groups are more diverse. And I suppose there's always some that have to be more diverse than others just by chance. And insects evolved about 380 million years ago and then flourished along with flowering plants. So a lot of people think the understanding about the richness and diversity of insects, you have to understand the richness and diversity of the plants that they feed on. So actually the question about why are insects so diverse, I would say you need to talk to a botanist to say why are plants so diverse, and then that will explain why so many insects have evolved in order to feed on the wide variety of plants that are available, because there's obviously if you like, a war going on between the plants and the insects, for the plants not to be eaten and the insects to feed on. And that leads to a really interesting evolutionary relationship and the processes of speciation.
And then also all the pollination dynamics as well, right? So the not necessarily a warring aspect, but still a co-evolutionary history, a very long one as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the plants benefit from the pollination as well, of course, as well as not wanting to be eaten.
Right. So, Jane, the main purpose of this discussion was to explore some of the claims that seem to be, I was going to say, increasingly common in the media and elsewhere, but actually, perhaps this has peaked. I think this might have peaked a few years ago. I'm not sure what your perception is there, but whatever the sort of trajectory has been, the kind of message has been that there's sort of an imminent demise of insects worldwide, of species and broader groups due to human activities. Could you just sort of summarize what those claims are, and perhaps just tell us sort of where they're being communicated as well, whether it's just the media or is it coming through scientific literature, or is it the disconnect between those two, perhaps?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is that people are really concerned about declines, and most of the data shows overall that there are declines. So the important point is to take the big picture and also to understand some of the nuances within that. So people are concerned about declines, and that evidence is in the scientific literature and is also being picked up by the general public as well. And, it's generated a lot of interest by governments and so on, looking in to see what the consequences of insect declines are. And that's important, I think, because a lot of conservation and a lot of conservation funding is directed to a very small proportion of species, which tend to be the vertebrates that are the sort of cute and cuddly ones. And obviously, people care a lot about those and about declines in those. And that's where a lot of research and funding and conservation goes. But they're a very small proportion of overall species on Earth. And of course, the other thing is the recognition that insects do a lot for us. So it's not just about conserving things that are of benefit to people. It's, there are moral and ethical reasons to conserve biodiversity. But with our insects, of course, there's lots of other things that they deliver for us. So they're important pollinators. So that's important for our food. They're important decomposers. So they're important for nutrient cycling. And they're also important natural predators. So they're a really good pest control, natural pest control as well. So that's why people are concerned about declines. And I guess what has come out of some of the big numbers and the very dramatic information that's come out is people wanting to understand that a little bit more. And of course, as you start to pick away at some of these stories and some of the information, you find out that there's a lot more nuance than appears from that top line number. So when you say overall insects are in decline, well, that doesn't mean every individual species is in decline. And it doesn't mean that every individual population of every individual species is showing the same metric as well. And it also doesn't mean that every measure of decline that we take is showing the same thing. So that nuance starts to break apart, which is understanding the long-term changes, understanding the differences between species, understanding what the different measures tell us, and also the fact that species may be undergoing different patterns of change in different parts of their range. So the challenge, I guess, is to give a simple message to government and to conservation organisations and to the general public to say we need to be concerned, but also the fact that not every species is showing that. And I think that difference between the simple message and the nuance and the complexities is sometimes where that message gets lost.
Where do you think it came from do you know what the genesis of the news headlines was? Because I'm kind of wondering if it was just because this word insectageddon is something that can easily grab attention. Is it something as basic as that? And also, why insects in particular? Because we're aware that all species are in trouble to some extent. So I was just wondering why insects in particular have stood out in this way.
It's a really interesting question because I suppose it's like anything, isn't it? Why does some particular activity capture people's attention at that particular time? I suppose it's a bit like, why does a tweet go viral? Why does it just suddenly happens for some reason? So, and I found it quite interesting because some of it is about the way in which scientists have sort of learned to sell their story. You want your science to be heard, and sometimes it gets picked up, and that's great. And perhaps the worse the message is, the more likely it is to get picked up, and so on. And there's an element there of what journalists want to read and the simplicity of what they want to read, and they want bad news, and that's what they want to put forward. So what was very interesting is the insectageddon came about from a paper that came up from a literature review across studies, came up with a number that they said that 40% of insect species were threatened with extinction over the next few decades. And I think it was the number that were going to go extinct, and then the fact that it was going to happen over the next few decades. That sort of got researchers thinking, that's a little bit over the top. Talking about declines is very different than talking about extinctions. So we know that things decline before they go extinct, but we also know that you can reverse declines and species might show quite a lot of variation in their abundance trends. So the idea that you would take the declines and turn that into an extinction seemed to be going a little bit beyond what the declines were saying. And then this thing about it was going to happen over the next few decades. So it was about not about the fact that things were not declining. I think it was about the scale and rapidity of the decline. And that was followed up by, there were some other papers that were talking about 75% declines in protected areas. And so that was sort of supporting some of these declines. And that was quite interesting because any of the student at the University of York who has tutorials with me will know that one of the papers I often talk about and we analyse and talk through was a paper by Jeremy Thomas and colleagues 20 years ago with looking at UK data and comparing birds, plants and insect changes in the UK over several decades. And the top line from that, so this was 20 years ago, one of the things that got the paper into a high impact journal, it got reported in Science, which is sort of one of the top journals, was that he and his colleagues pointed out how the situation was much more dire for butterflies than it was for birds or plants. And interestingly, his number of declines for butterflies in the UK was about 70%. So he had written 20 years ago that 70% of our British butterflies are in decline, but insectageddon didn't come along until more recently. So I guess the other thing was that we entomologists, perhaps we hadn't been fighting enough for our insects. We sort of knew they were in decline, but perhaps we hadn't been shouting enough about it and trying to get people to do things, because saying that insects are in decline and we knew about it doesn't sound to be quite right, really, does it? So that a more recent study that comes up with insectageddon, and we sort of say, well, these very high numbers that you're coming up with and the rapidity of extinctions is not quite what we believe. But nonetheless, we are concerned about insect declines.
And what happened? You said that paper was about 20 years ago, the butterfly paper. Did that more or less come to pass? Did the declines that were expected, did they decline as much as he had predicted?
So he wasn't predicting anything. He was just, Jeremy Thomas and colleagues, they weren't predicting. They were analysing the data that they have.
Okay.
So 20 years later, you can go back and reanalyze the butterfly data. So I was looking at the data that came out, the most recent State of Butterflies report. So the numbers for the state of butterflies in the UK are broadly similar. So if you go with the same data sets that Jeremy Thomas and colleagues used, which are the distribution data, the declines there are 74%. But that then does also mean that 26% are increasing. Do you see? So again, it's about understanding the nuance. And also, if you take another data set, so these data that I'm just talking about are butterflies and they are distribution data. So they are records of where butterflies occur in the UK. There's another really great data set for butterflies, which is based on walk and count transects. So these are data that tell you about abundance trends. So these are really useful data because they tell you about what are individual populations doing at a site. Are they increasing or declining? So these abundance trends are saying something a little bit different. So the abundance trends for the same period show that about half of the abundance trends are declines and about half are increases. This is where I was mentioning before that your metrics may tell you slightly different things. So your abundance trends tell you whether species are increasing or declining at a location, and the distribution records tell you whether the range of the species is increasing or not. And of course, a species could potentially be increasing its range whilst declining. And the other issue, of course, is that the walk and count transect information on abundances are much more robust from a repeatability perspective, because there's a standardized count that you do. You walk in a certain way, you count in a certain way, and people walk the same route over decades. So these data come, the butterfly monitoring scheme walk and count transects started in 1976. So although there's been slight change, there's been a lot more sites brought into the scheme, there are some sites that have been walked since 1976, every 2 weeks during the summer, every year for that time. So we got really good records. Whereas the distribution records, they're coming in through sort of citizen science programs where people are encouraged to record what they see. And so the issue with the distribution data is they're very valuable, but statistically you have to tweak them because of problems with biases and unequal recording effort.
Right. And also the fact that it's so new, right? I mean, this sort of level of citizen involvement didn't exist 20 years ago because of smartphones, essentially.
Yeah, so the numbers of records are going up hugely. And of course, with everybody with a smartphone, you get a very accurate GPS recording as well. Yeah, absolutely. But then you're sort of looking at the abundance trends and the distribution trends. And then additionally to me giving you those numbers of change, then of course, researchers are interested in whether those trends are significant or not. And when I use the term significant, I'm meaning statistically significant. So it's not using the term about whether they're important or not. Statisticians use the term significant for a particular level of change that is unlikely to be random.
Level of confidence, right?
Exactly. And what you find is that both the abundance and the distribution data sets have quite a high proportion of species that essentially are changing, but not significantly. And of course, insect abundances change hugely. There's enormous peaks and troughs, related to the local weather, local conditions. And so one of the problems with sampling insects, above all of those other things I've mentioned about identification and about whether they're a species or not, is that from year to year, you get huge fluctuations just naturally through to changes in the local environment that year. And so you need very long-term data to draw out the long-term trends from that annual year-to-year fluctuation, much more than you do for vertebrates or long-lived animals or plants. Because obviously, from one generation, insects can get through several generations a year, and those numbers can fluctuate hugely. And so long-term data are needed to remove that interannual variation from the long-term trend.
Right. So many complications and so many nuances, right? But at the same time, I guess, just to play devil's advocate, insect populations or insect species like other species are generally in a bit of trouble worldwide, due to ongoing land use change and other drivers. So the question there would be, and I think the question that a lot of people would ask is, what's the harm in exaggerating effects, I guess you could say, if we need to look after these populations anyway?
So I think the issues so I'm quite interested in messaging, and I guess one of the things that has been a positive outcome of these concerns is that governments and research funders and organizations have become concerned, and they put money into understanding it, and that's a good thing. So a very strong negative worrying message obviously galvanizes action. And so that's a good thing, because we should be concerned about insect declines. So sadly, people tend to only respond to bad news and very bad news, and then something happens. The important thing is that then is followed up with action to say, but we can do something about it. And the thing that always worries me about really bad news is that people get depressed by it and don't think that we can do anything about it. And actually, I'm a much more positive person who wants to be emphasizing the fact that there are a lot of species that are doing well. Many of them are doing well because of successful conservation intervention. But I am aware that governments don't respond as well, or funders don't respond as well if you say, these things are doing well. They then assume, well, we can just ignore those and move back to the ones that are doing badly. So there's that mix between the really strong negative messages galvanizing action, but making sure that people don't get despondent and depressed, thinking this is a terrible thing that is happening that we have no control over. Because then I think you give the good news stories and say, yes, we do know that things like, in agricultural landscapes, issues around pesticides, neonicotinoids, pesticides, that they've been designed to kill insects, and they are quite good at doing that. And so they then have knock-on effects on non-target species as well. We need to address that. But on the other hand, we do know ways in which keeping natural habitats within the landscape can be very beneficial. And then we need to have a conversation about which insects we want to keep, which ones we like, which ones and how we do that. And we do know how to do that. But the issue then is, do we have either the political motivation or the general public behind us to make those changes, and importantly, to put the money into doing that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting what you say about messaging. I'm also fascinated by messaging. Does it concern you that science may lose credibility by exaggerating claims, or even if it's not the fault of the scientists, but the maybe perhaps the fault of the journalists in inflating those claims? Do you worry about credibility as well as the doom and gloom side of things?
Yeah, and I think most scientists want to tell the truth. I think they they want to report what they're seeing in the data that they have got, and the whole process of science is through dialogue. And if you think you found something, you publish it, and then there's a dialogue where people say, well, actually, that's really interesting, but that's not what I see. This is what I see. And then someone else says, well, I see something completely different. And then someone comes in and says, well, actually, I think I can explain why you're all seeing something different, and I can bring in a bigger picture. And it's by that we start to understand which bits of information are more reliable, and which are general trends. And then the next step is, well, what are we going to do about that? So is it always the same species that are in decline, for example? So there was an interesting paper recently pointing out that actually some of the more common species are the ones that have been in most decline. And so that could be problematic, because given that they're highly abundant, if they decline, then the biomass of insects will decline because they're such a large proportion of it. But very often we focus on the rarer things because we think, because of their rarity, it's more important. So then I guess there's other questions about, well, if we're interested in and concerned about insects, not only for their own sake, but because within food chains, they're very important for other things we care about. They're important prey items as well. It's not just the pest services that they can provide, and pollination and decomposition and so forth. But, if we're concerned about insectivorous animals like birds and bats and so on, maybe they're not so fussy about exactly what they eat. But if the whole biomass of insects declines, then they will also suffer as well. And of course, you then need to know, is it the most common insects that are in decline? And then why might that be? And that then might feed into other discussions. For instance, in the UK and Europe at the moment, there's a big push around rewilding. So what can you do to your garden or your allotment or in a town, to the road verges or whatever? And that might benefit generalists quite well. And yet people are concerned more about the rare things and not that, the rare things don't benefit very often from rewilding. And so that then leads into a much bigger conversation about which insects do we want to conserve and which ones do we want to help boost. And of course, everybody will have a different view on that. But we do know, certainly for the butterflies, we do know if species are in decline and we want to reverse that decline, we sort of know what we need to do. And then that's about putting in the resources and the funding to bring about change. And there are some great examples in the UK of where that has happened, basically. We've said we care about this species, we're going to do something about it, and its population then increases.
Next time, I'll be speaking about the European farmer protests, regenerative agriculture, and related agricultural topics with Philippe Burker, who is founder of Climate Farmers. Please join us.